enzymes that we're going to talk about for photosynthesis, I would strongly suggest that you either download them and have them on your machine electronically so that you can annotate them, or print them. Okay, somehow have a version of the handouts that you can manipulate color right on, annotate. All right. So chloroplast. This is an organelle inside of the cytoplasm of plant cells. And this is where photosynthesis happens. Where photosynthesis actually happens is inside of the chloroplast. And it's actually on this membrane here. The photosystems are embedded actually in that membrane right there. Okay, so when we talk about photosynthesis, you want a plant cell, and then the plant is that little green ball, right, the chloroplast. And then actually inside of that are these little stacks of membranes called thylakoids, and then the whole stack is called a grana. And this is where the macromolecules are made. And then the macromolecules diffuse out of the chloroplast into the cytoplasm, or they are packaged and transported across the cell. Okay, so we need to tackle this little baby right here. Okay, so if I were you, I would keep the colors that you used here consistent. Okay, because we are going to use those same colors when we get into, and when we get into all of the chemistry of photosynthesis and cell it's a cycling of the same carbon, the same hydrogen, and the same two oxygens. Okay, so I need probably green too. So it's really important that you keep these colors the same, right? So what we're looking at here, we're simply zooming in on the class. I'm taking this organelle here, we're zooming in on it, and we're going to get into the chemistry here. Okay, so which organelle is that?
The chloroplast.
That is the chloroplast. Okay, so if this is the chloroplast, get a pen on that, shall we? If this is the chloroplast, then what is this out here?
Cytoplasm.
Totally agree. This is the cytoplasm. Okay. Then, what is that? What is that membrane there?
Plasma membrane.
Yep. You always have to remember where you are in the cell. Always. Okay. And then why would I put a thick line over that? What's that going to be?
The cell wall.
Totally agree. Nice. Okay, so what we're doing is we're drilling down into the chloroplast here. Okay, cool. So then what else do we know? This cycle here, notice how this is not inside of any structure. This is the Calvin cycle here, all right? So this is in the fluid of the cell, all right? And what's the fluid of the cell called? Excuse me, the fluid of the chloroplast, not the cell. What is this fluid here?
Stroma.
That is the stroma. Okay. Well, if that's the stroma, then we have these individual membranes here, like such. And actually, that's green on. No, I'll go ahead and put that on as black. So what about this individual bag here? Odd term. What is this term for the individual bag here?
Thylakoid.
That is the thylakoid. Awesome. And then, of course, you have a stack of these thylakoids. That is gone. Okay, cool. So, what goes into that box right there? Or actually, it's not a box at all. What goes into that circle? What do you think that is? What comes in?
Water, H2O.
That would be water. Excellent. Okay. So we're going to drop in water here. So here is where I would step back to your reaction here, and I'm going to grab green and orange so it's consistent, okay? The right-hand side of your brain learns through colors and pictures. And so the more often that you can supply the right-hand side of your brain with colors as you're learning this chemistry, the better. If you have colors, great. If you don't, then use my handouts. You're more than welcome. Okay, so here's water. Got it. Now, what is this lightning bolt here then? What do you think that is?
The sun's
Light.
energy.
Sure, that's the sunlight. Now, while this is an excellent handout, it only shows light once, which you, of course, know that light comes in twice, okay? So there are times where this handout provides some wonderful detail, and then there's a couple parts where they're general, and that's fine, okay? So understand that while they show light once, this is the light source, but the light is actually used twice in here, okay? All right, so what happens to the water? The light comes in, the light is used to do what to the water?
Split it with photolysis.
Yep, split it by photolysis, and ultimately to pull what out of the water?
High
Low
energy
energy
electrons.
electrons.
Yep, low energy electrons. That's why we water our plants, okay? Water provides low energy electrons. Cool. Well, if water is giving up its electrons, what is the aim of that process as the water gives up its electrons?
Oxidation.
That's oxidation. So water is oxidized, okay? Now, there are two photosystems that we will get into in just one second. Which one comes first? Photosystem 2, yes. Okay. So since photosystems are both here and your light is only involved here, this is called the light dependent reactions. Okay, because both of these reactions of photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 depend on light. Therefore, they are called light dependent. Do you see light coming in over here at all?
No.
No. So if it is light dependent, what do you think we call this?
Light independent.
Light independent. Okay. Now, if you get a really, really, really old school professor, they might refer to these as the light and dark reactions. But I mean, that's like 20, 30 years old. That's an old term, okay? We stopped calling them the light and dark reactions because then students thought that this reaction here only happened when?
At night.
At night. Okay, which isn't the case at all. As long as there are the reactants to make this cycle run, the cycle runs. Whether it's daytime or nighttime, doesn't matter. So long time ago, we called this light and dark. Almost nobody uses that anymore. It's light dependent and light independent, okay? The whole point of the oxidation of water is that these low energy electrons become high energy electrons. Okay, that's the whole point, right? Now, these high energy electrons, we show here, as if this hydrogen is glowing with the hydrogens, okay? I'm ignoring this and I'm ignoring this. We'll talk about that in just one second. This hydrogen then enters this cycle over here. Which cycle is this?
Calvin cycle.
You bet. Excellent. It's Calvin cycle. Okay. This is a light independent reaction. There's no light required here at all. What's coming in here? That's going to bond to these hydrogens.
Carbon
CO2.
dioxide.
Yep, CO2. Nice. Carbon dioxide. Same thing. I'm going to go back to my equations. I used purple and yellow. So there's purple. Oh, I've lost yellow. There we go. Purple was for the carbon, wasn't it? Yeah. So here's purple. Here's yellow. Right? So then the carbon dioxide enters the Calvin cycle, ultimately is bonded to these high energy electrons to make C6H12O6. Okay? And this would be here. This would be, is that right? That's right, that's green. I always try to double and triple check with the crayons, because if you make a mistake with the crayon, it's not like you can erase it. And then using whiteout and then crayons over whiteout is terrible. All right. And then now understand that what this really makes over here is a product called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Nobody says that, all right? We just call it G3P. But that, of course, is later. We'll talk about that next Tuesday. Okay, so technically the Calvin cycle makes G3P, and G3P is a building block for all macromolecules. Okay, plants can take G3P and make anything. They can make carbohydrates, they can make nucleic acids, they can make amino acids, and they can make lipids. G3P is the foundation molecule. Okay, but when we first teach the chemistry to have you understand the cycling of the water and how it's split, and the carbon dioxide and the macromolecules, we use glucose because that example is super clean. All right, so then
Oxygen.
oxygen. Now, this oxygen that plants release came from where? The oxygen that's a byproduct, where did that oxygen come from?
The water.
From the water. Excellent. Okay, so plants take in the water, they split the water, oxygen, byproduct. Okay, the hydrogen you will find out is actually split between protons and electrons. That's next week, and it's the electrons that are then bonded to the carbon dioxide. Now, if carbon dioxide is picking up this high energy electron, right? What process do I need to put right there? Since carbon dioxide is gaining electrons.
Reduction.
Totally agree. Okay, so in autolysis, water, and in the cycle, carbon dioxide reduced. Oxidation always comes first, and once any molecule or substrate is oxidized, then some other molecule or substrate is then reduced. So you're transferring the electrons, ultimately, the water to the macromolecule. Okay? And then in about 3 weeks, you'll find out that when all cells do cellular respiration, they rip high energy electrons at macromolecule. Macromolecules bond to oxygen, back to water. Water to macromolecules. It just cycles back and forth. Life is really based on the transfer of electrons. It's chemistry. Okay. I have this little box sitting right here. Okay. So there's an electron carrier. Someone carries these electrons. Okay. And this electron carrier is called NADP. I should show you this. Go over here and you type in NADP. Get a load of its name. Right? Say, what is NADP? It's that. Nicotinamide, adenine, dinucleotide, phosphate. Okay? Nobody says nicotinamide, adenine, nucleotide. Nobody says that. Okay? What do we call this molecule? Of course. Hey, we all call it NADP. Okay? NADP. But if you want to know the formal name, there's the formal name. Okay? NADP. What does NADP do? NADP is an electron carrier. Well, what does that mean? Means it carries electrons. Okay? Except the charge, there's my highlighter. The charge on NADP is positive. Okay, so there's an electron carrier called NADP. And what NADP does is NADP hangs out with a proton. Are you comfortable with this notation? Are you comfortable that that is a proton? Have you seen this notation before?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There is in chemistry there is an enormous difference between this and that. Okay. This is hydrogen. Okay. This is an atom. At room temperature, this is a gas, and if you put flame to it, this explodes. Oh, that should be an S. Hydrogen gas is actually really dangerous. Okay. Where this is a proton. This is a subatomic particle, and it's found in the nucleus. Okay, so there is a big difference between hydrogen. This is an element that's on the periodic table. This is a proton. This is a subatomic particle where you have protons and neutrons in the nucleus of an atom, and then orbiting around the nucleus are the electrons. Does that make sense in chemistry? Comfortable there? Okay, so there's a big difference between H and H plus. And for students, it's a minor little change, and chemically, huge difference. Okay, so this electron carrier, NADP, hangs out with what we call an associated proton. Okay, so what is this proton here for? Because if this is an electron carrier, that means that these high energy electrons are picked up by these two. Well, if NADP is positive and NADP picks up an electron, what happens to the overall charge of NADP? What does it become?
Neutral.
Neutral. Excellent. NADP. Now, if you bond an electron to a proton, what do you make? One electron, one proton. What is that?
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen.
That's hydrogen. Okay. So when we talk about NADP being an electron carrier, that's true. It only carries one electron. Okay. This associated proton picks up the other electron. So then you get NADP plus an H. And so when NADP picks up electrons, it forms NADPH. Right? So these are going to be our high energy electrons, like such, which means then this has a high energy electron, and this has a high energy electron, which is why then this is carrying high energy electrons. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to write right here NADP plus, and then whether or not you add the associated proton is totally up to you. You need to be sure and write NAD plus, and if you want to write the plus H plus, it's fine with me. NADP comes in here, picks up these high energy electrons, and what am I going to write right there?
NADP.
Yep. So then NADPH drops the electron off. When NADPH drops the electron off, it goes back to being NADP. And then it picks the electrons up, and then it drops them off. And then it picks them up and drops them off. And this is what NADP does 24 hours a day, as long as there's high energy electrons and carbon dioxide present. Okay, the Calvin cycle works just about 24 hours a day. All it needs is carbon dioxide. That's a non-issue. So all the plant has to really have is high energy electrons. Okay. The starburst. In almost every biological diagram, what's the starburst?
ATP.
ATP. And you go, hold it. the chloroplast makes ATP. You go, hold it. I thought the mitochondrion makes ATP. The mitochondrion does make ATP. Okay. The chloroplast makes a little bit of ATP, but not for in the rest of the cell. Okay. The chloroplast makes just enough ATP to power, guess what? Just enough ATP to power what?
Oh,
The Calvin cycle.
Calvin cycle. Okay. The mitochondrion produces those 36 ATP for the rest of the cell. Okay. The mitochondrion is the power plant or the powerhouse of the cell. Totally. Okay. However, the chloroplast makes a little bit of ATP, not for the cell, just enough to power the Calvin cycle. Okay. So when ATP is consumed and powers the enzymes of the Calvin cycle, ATP gets hydrolyzed. ATP gets broken down. Well, when you take energy out of ATP, what am I going to write right here?
ADP plus P.
ADP plus P. That's a D, I swear. There we go. Okay. Now, sometimes students get confused because, get a load of this, NADP and ADP. There's ADP twice. Two very different things. NADP is an electron carrier. ADP is an energy carrying molecule that will then turn around and be powered here. Okay. Comfortable?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So, photosystem 2, photosystem 1. There's two photosystems here. So guess what this handout is?
The photosystems.
Yep. Which one comes first?
2.
2. Ridiculous. But that's the way it is. So we'll work with it. Oh, let's focus that. All right. So photosystem 2. And photosystem 1. You already know about 80% of this diagram. There's actually just a couple things new. There's something new here, and there's something new here. You know everything else, okay? So the whole point of photosystem 2 is water. This is all about water. Water, 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 water. Well, what happens to water inside of plants? Water is
Phosphate.
oxidized. Boom. So the whole point of photosystem 2 is to oxidize water. So what do you think's in that little circle right there?
Water.
Water. So I need a little, is it green and orange? Yep. So I need a little green. I need a little orange, and then I'm going to zoom in on that. That's too small. There we go. That's better. There's water. All right. So this is then going to be oxidation. I should probably write that in black. Okay. There's not oxygen. Here's what's interesting. Two little circles there, yes? Okay. These are actually electrons. Okay, so we'll get into this detail more tomorrow. The hydrogen is actually broken down into its electron and its hydrogen. Excuse me, its proton. Wow. Hydrogen is broken into its electron and its proton. Okay, so this handout is going to address the electrons. Okay, so low energy electrons are here. The light comes in. Now, what these little green discs are, that's actually chlorophyll. And there's some really interesting physics that happens here, where the little particles of light called photons literally hit the chloroplast and make the chloroplast ring like a bell, okay? And as the energy is transferred to the chloroplast and it literally vibrates, okay? That energy is then transferred to the electrons, and the electrons are already spinning. This is so cool. So as the chlorophyll is vibrating, that makes that energy is transferred to the electrons, and the electrons then spin faster. And when an electron spins faster, we then define it as a high energy electron. Okay, so actually the difference between a low energy electron and a high energy electron is how fast the electron spins. The physics here is just, it's pretty cool. All right, so the whole point of photosystem 2 is to excite the electrons. And you say, all right, why? Why are these electrons excited? Because they're going to be handled by this process right here. Now, do you ever have to memorize the protein PQ and the cytochrome complex and the PC? Never, okay? There are a series of proteins here, and this series of proteins handles these electrons and transports the electrons between photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Well, what do you think you call the chain of proteins that transport electrons? What do you think we call that?
Oh, electron transport chain.
The electron transport chain. Okay, this is nothing more than a series of proteins that transport electrons. And as the electrons are transported, energy is pulled out, meaning that these electrons start as high energy and end up as what?
Low energy.
Low energy. Okay, then some magic happens. The energy is pulled out of the electrons to make ATP. Now, do you think there's some detail there?
Yeah.
Totally. We're skipping it right now. We'll talk about it later. We'll actually talk about that Tuesday. Okay, so just for right now, just trust me. And when the electrons are transported, ATP is produced. And we'll get into the specifics. It's not difficult. It's just too much for right now. So the whole point of photosystem 1 ultimately is to excite electrons to make what?
ATP.
ATP. That's the whole point of photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 does three things. It oxidizes water, it excites electrons, and then makes ATP. That's the job of photosystem 2. Oxidize water, excite the electrons, make ATP. Because ultimately, this ATP right here, it's not for the cell, right? This ATP is only to power the Calvin cycle. That's it. It's just a little bit of ATP to power the Calvin cycle. All right, but we have a problem. What's the problem?
The electrons are low energy.
They're low energy, okay? So what do we do? Well,
Excite them.
what do plants do?
Take in light.
Sure, they take in light and they excite them. The chlorophyll is used again. Chlorophyll is just a photosynthetic pigment that absorbs the energy from the light. And those low energy electrons get re-excited as high energy electrons. And then they're sitting right here. Electron. I love how small these circles are, by the way. They're just tiny. That says electron, I promise. These are your high energy electrons right there. Okay. These high energy electrons need a carrier. Which carrier? Which carrier picks up these electrons? Right there. Who's the carrier?
NADP.
NADP. So that means NADP is going to pick up these electrons, which means that NADP is
Neutralized, or it's reduction.
it's reduced, you bet. Okay. So this NADP is reduced, and what's going to go into that box there?
NADPH.
NADPH. Put the green right here. And here's your high energy electrons trapped right in there. Okay. It's an enzyme. This is the enzyme that reduces NADP. Okay. So think of the name of the enzyme. Let's say DNA polymerase. Okay. It ends in ACE because it's an enzyme. Okay. It's then a polymerase because it's an enzyme that makes polymers. It polymerizes. That's the verb, right? So it's DNA polymerase. A polymerase is an enzyme that polymerizes. What's the verb that this enzyme does here? What is the verb here for this enzyme? What is it doing?
Reducing.
It's reducing. So if that's the verb, reduce, right? And then ACE means enzyme. What's the name of this enzyme here? It is a...
Reductase.
Yep. It's a reductase. Okay? Always with science, I never want you intimidated by the vocabulary. They're just words. Find out what they mean. Okay? And most often, the roots of the words have meaning. Okay? Don't just memorize that that's a reductase. Understand why it's a reductase. Okay? ACE is for enzyme. It does the process of reduction, or it reduces. Therefore, it is a reductase. Okay? Let's go back to the name of DNA polymerase. DNA polymerase. This is an enzyme that polymerizes DNA. Okay? So this reductase is an enzyme that reduces. It reduces what?
NADP.
Yep, NADP. Thus, the enzyme that's there is NADP reductase. Again, understand why that enzyme has that name. Check it out. Okay, now, an hour ago, had you heard of any of this stuff? Even 45 minutes ago? Most of it? No. Okay, don't be intimidated by this. Just because it's new, just because it's unfamiliar, doesn't mean that it is difficult. It's simply unfamiliar. Okay, so what I'll do tomorrow is I'll bring in the same two handouts, right? I'll reprint them, but I'll print them blank, right? And then we'll go through it again. The way that you learn biochemistry is to become familiar with it. NADP, NADPH, ADP, ATP, electron transport chain, NADP reductase, oxidation reduction, photosystem 2, photosystem 1, right? It's vocabulary. You simply have to put the vocabulary in context and understand what's the whole point of this. There's two photosystems. The first photosystem oxidizes water, right? And excites the electrons and makes ATP. The second photosystem, right, excites the electrons and then bonds those high energy electrons to NADP to make NADPH. And now this ATP and this NADPH are the same ATP and NADPH right here. So what's going on right there is this. This is right there. Okay? So this is quite a bit of chemistry to drop into your lab. So we will go through this again tomorrow, and then we will get into the Calvin cycle next Tuesday. right? And same thing, just take it layer by layer by layer and then back up and do layer, and then back up, right? It's constantly going back and practicing what's before it and then add a new layer and then practice and a new layer, always.